The mother's return to save the daughter from the Sadian libertine is dramatically restaged in The Bloody Chamber, an extravagantly literary rewriting of Perrault's 17th century fairy tale, Le Berbe Bleu, Bluebird, 1697, that is firmly entrenched in the structures of the Sadian pornograph. Traditionally interpreted as a cautionary tale about female curiosity and punishment that befalls the Eve-like young woman who seeks too much knowledge, Perrault's version of Bluebeard emphasizes the figure of the victim heroine at the hands of a violent and murderous patriarch. In The Bloody Chamber, Bluebeard is reimagined as a profligate marquis, an identification that places him in a specifically Sadian tradition, with a taste for Wagner, Baudelaire, literary and visual pornography, and the opulent fashion designs of the Orientalist couturier Paul Poiret. The depiction of the Marquis references in particular the real Bluebeard, Gilles de Rais, the 15th century Breton nobleman and companion of Jeanne d'Arc, who tortured, sexually abused, and murdered children. Representing the limits of evil, Gilles de Rais was a source of fascination in decadent art and literature, and famously provides the focus of J.K. Huysmans' La Bas, The Damned, published in 1891, a copy of which, from some over-exquisite private press, is displayed in the Marquis's library. The Bloody Chamber is thoroughly saturated with literary and artistic allusions to the pornographic scenario at the heart of the Bluebeard narrative. As its specifically French setting, in both geographical and literary terms, intimates, it is also concerned with interrogating a tradition of fetishistic representations of victimized and dehumanized femininity that comes up through Sade's Gothic pornography and takes reinvigorated form in decadent Gothic imaginings of female sexuality. Seduced by the Marquis's lavish gifts, which include a white muslin poire dress and a choker of rubies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat, and the sheer carnal avarice of his lustful gaze, the nameless narrator senses in herself a potentiality for corruption that takes her breath away. It is with this masochistic willingness that the daughter makes her journey from adolescence to womanhood, a journey that requires her to leave behind the white, enclosed quietude of her mother's apartment for the sumptuous, decadent interior of the Marquis's Gothic castle. The castle, with its spiked gate, a version of the thorny hedge, and embedded torture chambers, is explicitly identified as operating under the sign of the prick. At home neither on the land nor on the water, a mysterious amphibious place, contravening the materiality of both earth and waves. It bears a particular resemblance to the cannibal Minsky's castle in Sade's Juliet, which, Carter describes in The Sadian Woman, is a place of privilege with a strong symbolic resonance to the great original of all places of privilege, the womb. It is this womb-like space that becomes the site of the daughter's education in Sadian femininity at the hands of a violent patriarch. Nevertheless, the ambivalent borders of the Gothic castle are signaled from the outset. As soon as the nameless narrator steps off the train, she smells the amniotic salinity of the ocean that at once parodies and presages the mother's return. Like Eugénie de Franville and Eugénie de Mistival, the nameless narrator embarks upon a sexual education under the Marquis's supervision. The formal disrobing of the bride that takes place in the bedroom echoes a ritual from the brothel. This most pornographic of all confrontations, the narrator notes, imitates the scenario of a living image of an etching by Rops, in which a child with her stick-like limbs, naked but for button boots, her gloves shielding her face with her hand, is examined by an old monocled lecher. Relentlessly caught up in the reflections of male desire, the narrator remarks upon the preponderance of mirrors surrounding the marital bed. So many mirrors on all the walls, in stately frames of contorted gold, a dozen husbands in a dozen mirrors. Here she is aligned with Eugenie de Mistaval, who, in the early stages of her education, remarks upon the many mirrors in the boudoir. The purpose of all these mirrors, Madame de Saint-Onge assures her, is to ensure that the whole body is visible so that no part of the body can remain hidden. Everything must be seen. So many delicious tableaux. Although the narrator does not praise this marvelous invention with the same excitement as Eugenie, she is nonetheless aghast to feel herself stirring in response to this pornographic exchange. And thus the Marquise closes her legs like a book, and the first lesson is over. Absorbed in this brief scene from a voluptuary life, the Sadian Gothic heroine in process is disgruntled when it is abruptly drawn to a close by the Marquis's business trip. The next stage of the narrator's Sadian education takes place in the library, which, with its dark, gleaming paneling and pulsing red rugs, is a simulacrum of the womb space. It echoes in particular the womb-like haven of Huysmans Erebeurs, which, replete with an embalmed alcove, sacred ornaments, and an altar dedicated to poetry, provides a consummate illustration of the bourgeois idolatry of art. As she browses the row upon row of calf-bound volumes, brown and olive, with gilt lettering on their spines, the octavo in brilliant scarlet morocco, the tingling in the narrator's fingertips brings her to an image she had not bargained for. The girl with her tears hanging on her cheeks like stuck pearls, her cunt a split fig below the great globes of her buttocks, on which the knotted tails of the cat were about to descend, while a man in a black mask fingered with his free hand his prick, that curved upwards like the scimitar he held. The picture had a caption, "Reproof of Curiosity." The narrative focalization emphasizes that, although she is startled by the image, the pornographic language here belongs to the narrator. For, as Robin Ann Sheets points out, she is also in possession of knowledge passed on from her mother, who, with all the precision of her eccentricity, had told me what it was that lovers did. I was innocent, but not naive. Catching sight of another steel engraving entitled Immolation of the Wives of the Sultan, the narrator's recall of her mother's teaching gives her enough awareness this time to gasp. The bloody chamber does not only reinscribe the maternal relation that is often effaced in fairy tale and Gothic narratives. It also provides the eagle-featured indomitable mother with her own history and agency. What other student at the conservatoire could boast that her mother had outfaced a junkful of Chinese pirates, nursed a village through a visitation of the plague, shot a man-eating tiger with her own hand, and all before she was as old as I? The mother is thus repositioned as vital to both the daughter's sexual education and her emancipation from the pornographic structures of the Gothic discipline of suffering. The Marquise has identified in the nameless narrator a promise of debauchery only a connoisseur could detect. He is not, however, the only authority in this text. It is following a phone call with her mother and the newly found exhilaration of the explorer that the nameless narrator decides to search the castle looking for evidence of her husband's true nature. She faces the bloody chamber at the heart of the Marquise's castle with the nerves and will she has inherited from her mother. My mother's spirit drove me on, into that dreadful place, in a cold ecstasy to know the very worst. Set against the mother's spirit is a particular corporeal representation of the torture chamber located in the viscera of the castle, its walls gleaming as if they were sweating with fright. Here, in an emblematic Gothic transformation, the womb is exchanged for the tomb. The spectacle of the multiple bleeding and mutilated dead bodies of the Marquis's previous wives in the forbidden chamber echoes both the mirror images of the multiple impaled brides in the bedroom and the images of the dismembered bodies in the library. This is the final tableau in the Marquis's Sadian pedagogy. Embalmed and bearing the blue imprints of the strangler's fingers, the body of the opera singer, one of the Marquis's previous wives, is displayed like a Gothic sleeping beauty, while the skull of another young woman is utterly denuded and strung up by a system of unseen cords, so that it appeared to hang disembodied in the still heavy air. Crowned with a veil of lace and a wreath of white roses, it is the final image of his bride. The Gothic centerpiece of this macabre theater is the body of the Romanian countess, which lies bleeding in an iron maiden, pierced not by one but by 100 spikes, this child of the land of the vampires who seemed so newly dead, so full of blood. Straight from the recesses of the Sadian Gothic imagination, these female bodies have been used to play out the pornographic scripts of femininity that are embedded in the deathly spaces of this Gothic castle. They are reduced to just another set of collectibles in the Marquis's Museum of Perversity. Whereas Madame de Mistival arrives under the shadow of a paternal instruction that is tantamount to a death sentence, the mother in the bloody chamber arrives to lift the death sentence that has been inflicted upon the daughter in response to a kind of maternal telepathy. A crazy, magnificent horsewoman in widow's weeds, the mother returns to the text to liberate her daughter. Storming the Gothic castle, the daughter's prison, just at the moment the Marquis raises his heavy sword over the narrator's head, she ruptures the pornographic fantasy. The puppet master, open-mouthed, wide-eyed, impotent, at the last, saw his dolls break free of their strings, abandon the rituals he had ordained for them since time began, and start to live for themselves. The king, aghast, witnesses the revolt of his pawns. It is the mother, then, who animates the daughter by liberating her from a position as the father's doll pawn. The mother's appearance, armed and on horseback, echoes Jeanne d'Arc, who haunts the text through her association with Gilles de Rais. But she is also reminiscent of the pistol-carrying revolutionary Théroigne de Méricourt. You never saw such a wild thing as my mother, her hat seized by the winds and blown out to sea, so that her hair was her white mane, her black lisle legs exposed to the thigh, her skirts tucked round her waist, one hand on the reins of the rearing horse, while the other clasped my father's service revolver. Celebrated as an Amazon of the French Revolution, both sexually and politically liberated, the famously fiery Méricourt played an active role in the French Revolution and the pursuit of liberty for men and women. She represents, then, an image of the political possibilities of the Sadian woman who seizes the father's power, placing the question of paternal authority in a broader political and historical context. The Marquis, in turn, stood stock still as if she had been Medusa, the sword still raised over his head, as in those clockwork tableaux of Bluebeard that you see in glass cases at fairs. Turned to stone by the Medusa's gaze, he falls victim to his own iconography and the mother's death sentence. The point is, Carter writes in a letter to Elaine Jordan, that Bluebeard, it turns out at the end, is only cardboard, a construction, an invention, nothing, like the authority of the father. The authority of the father is revealed to be as fragile as it is atrocious. Mother is a figure of speech. Mother is a figure of speech. If the Sadian woman exposes the illusory freedom granted to the daddy's girl who operates within the patriarchal structures of the pornograph, it is equally engaged with challenging mythologized notions of motherhood and the maternal, emerging from Anglo-American second-wave feminist celebrations of the mother goddess. From the beginning of the book, Carter insists on the dangers of installing hypothetical great goddesses as consolation for women's culturally determined lack of access to the modes of intellectual debate. All the mythic versions of women, from the myth of the redeeming purity of the virgin to that of the healing, reconciling mother, are consolatory nonsenses. And consolatory nonsenses seem to me a fair definition of myth anyway. Mother goddesses are just as silly a notion as father gods. The Sadian woman proposes the demytholization not only of the structures of paternal power, but also of the maternal archetype and its iconographies. Reviving the myth of the mother goddess might, Carter suggests, give women emotional satisfaction, but it does so at the price of obscuring the real conditions of life. This is why they were invented in the first place. The mystification of the maternal, feminine, and the reproductive function, she argues later in the book, puts those women who wholeheartedly subscribe to it in voluntary exile from the historical world, this world, in its historical time that is counted 1 minute by minute. Carter links the rejection of the institution of motherhood to the political emancipation of women from imprisoning mythological frameworks. What she identifies in Sade's work are the revolutionary possibilities of its desacralization of the mother as a site of mystification. The demystification of the mother goddess and the eternal feminine provides a focus for the passion of New Eve. A particularly raw and savage book, this text anticipates some of the theoretical preoccupations elucidated in the Sadian Woman, a novel framed by 2 pregnancies and structured around the surgical procedure that transforms Evelyn into Eve. The novel was conceived, Carter's choice of word here is knowing, as a feminist tract about the social creation of femininity. The text is narrated retrospectively by Evelyn, a Baudelairean dandy, who is obsessed with Tristessa de Saint-Ange, a Hollywood movie star who embodies the victimized Gothic femininity that is exemplified by Sade's Justine and Poe's Madeline Usher. Suffering was her vocation. She suffered exquisitely until suffering became demoted. Susan Sellers suggests that Tristessa's full name effectively heralds her appeal of angelic suffering, but it also links her to Madame de Saint-Ange from Sade's Philosophy in the Bedroom. For Tristessa, who is revealed to be a man, also upholds a male fantasy of femininity. When she is eventually discovered, Tristessa inhabits a moonlit Gothic house made of glass. This mausoleum, like Sleeping Beauty's castle, is a space touched by time. Spiders had woven their vague trapezes between the friable heads of dead peonies in enormous glass jars, and clouds of dust fill the air. But in its mystification of suffering femininity, it is a glass house located outside of history, revolving on a mysterious axle deep in the earth. When Evelyn finally finds his dream woman, she is lying on her bier in the midst of a waxwork collection called the Hall of Immortals. She had cheated the clock in her castle of purity, her ice palace, her glass shrine. She was a sleeping beauty who could never die, since she had never lived. Embodying femininity as a mystification, the celluloid Tristessa exists only in the mirror images and reflections of male desire. Evelyn retrospectively acknowledges that he only loved her because she was not of this world. It is with a similar Hollywood dream in mind that Evelyn leaves London and arrives in the lurid Gothic darkness of a stinking, shimmering New York, where civil war is about to break out. With its skies full of strange, bright, artificial colors, reeking of decay, the cityscape echoes the greenish or purplish backgrounds in which we can glimpse the phosphorescence of decay that Baudelaire admired in Poe and recreated in his construction of the city in The Painter of Modern Life. From the wanton savagery of the city emerges the prostitute, Leela, a girl all softly black in color, who leads Evelyn deep into the geometric labyrinth of the city, into an arid world of ruins and abandoned construction sites, the megapolitan heart that did not beat anymore. Not so much Ariadne as a little fox pretending to be a siren, Leela is interpreted by Evelyn as the city's gift to him. Dancing her naked dance for Evelyn, and as black as his shadow, Leela, like Duval, is a creation of the Baudelairean imagination. She is also the whore to Tristeza's suffering femininity. Evelyn's desire for Layla vanishes, however, when she becomes pregnant and nearly bleeds to death after an illegal abortion. When her reproductive body emerges from the performance of sexualized femininity she is supposed to uphold. Infected by the slow, delirious sickness of femininity, Evelyn leaves New York and heads west, where he is kidnapped and imprisoned by a group of guerrilla warrior women. Evelyn's re-education, his transformation into Eve, begins at the hands of Mother. In the Passion of New Eve, as Suleiman notes, defies summary, which is one of its charms and one of the ways in which Carter succeeds in producing a new kind of writing, even while apparently remaining within the bounds of a certain traditional narrative logic. The idea of envisaging the new, a new kind of writing, and a new kind of being, as Carter puts it, is central to the text. Like the infernal desire machines of Dr. Hoffman, the text presents a kaleidoscopic intertextuality. According to Britzolakis, the Passion of New Eve is locked into a regressive circulation of literary metaphors of fatal, apparitional, and mechanical femininity. From Poe and Baudelaire to the symbolists. The novel undoubtedly engages in, and even indulges, an excessive intertextuality. The novel undoubtedly engages in, and even indulges, an excessive intertextuality, drawing on a tradition of fetishistic representations of femininity. It is constructed as a kind of Frankenstein's monster, built out of literary fragments and illusions. This echo of Mary Shelley's hideous progeny is also important in terms of the novel's Gothic inheritance, both in its interpretation as a birth myth that encodes the drama of guilt, dread, and flight surrounding birth and its consequences, and also in its laying bare of the male scientist's fantasy of procreative power. Most directly, as Suleiman points out, the title of the novel references Villiers Diel Adams' Livre Futur. A key work of French decadence, Livre Futur bears the Gothic influence of Poe's and Hoffman's fetishized visions of mechanical femininity, as well as Frankenstein's reworking of the creation myth. The text centers on the creation of a female android by Thomas Edison, a fictionalized version of the American scientist and inventor of, amongst other devices, the phonograph. Built in his subterranean, womb-like laboratory from a combination of dark magic and electricity, Ellison's android, Hadley, is a magical, mechanical being in the image of perfect femininity. She is not simply one of his many inventions, but, as Raymond Bellour describes, located at the very source of his capacity to invent. In The Passion of New Eve, Edison, the father-inventor, is reborn as Mother, the leader of a radical feminist sect who presides over the underground town Beulah. An antidote to the male scientists and puppet masters elsewhere in Carter's fiction, Mother is born of an unlikely dialogue between second-wave feminist notions of goddess feminism and male-authored decadent representations of femininity. the ironic negation of tristessa's punishing definition of femininity. Mother is the great, black, self-appointed prophetess, the self-created godhead that had assumed the flesh of its own prophecy. With 2 tiers of nipples, giant limbs, and a false beard of crisp black curls like the false beard queen Hatshepsut of the 2 kingdoms had worn, she incarnates the spectacle of the goddess. Nevertheless, at once Frankenstein and her creation, she is a woman self-made by the surgeon's knife. She was her own mythological artifact. She had reconstructed her flesh painfully, with knives and with needles, into a transcendental form as an emblem, as an example, and flung a patchwork quilt stitched from her daughter's breasts over the cathedral of her interior, the cave within a cave. She may embody the figure of the mother goddess envisioned by Mary Daly in Beyond God the Father, but she also gives form to decadent imaginings of the castratory femme fatale. This woman, who calls herself the Great Parricide, also glories in the title of Grand Emasculator. A knife-wielding surgeon, she behaves, to quote Nicole Ward-Jouve, as the Freudian little boy's worst nightmare. Although, like Edison, Mother is a great scientist, her extraordinary experiments involve not the making of woman but the remaking of man. Having made herself in the image of the mother goddess, Mother plans to remake Evelyn as her daughter Eve by surgically removing his genitals, excavating a fructifying female space inside him, and turning him into a perfect specimen of womanhood. Finally, she plans to reactivate the parthenogenesis archetype by impregnating him with his own sperm. The spectacle of Evelyn's transformation reimagines the self-consciously theatrical assault and infection of Madame de Mistival in Philosophy in the Bedroom in a reimagined Garden of Eden. Here, however, it is the mother who wreaks vengeance upon Evelyn, punishing him for his misogynistic treatment of her daughter Leela by turning him into her identical. Evelyn will be reborn a new Eve and the Virgin Mary too. She will become, in other words, both mother and daughter, the virgin mother of her new self. The second part of this daughter's education is later taught by the Sadian Zero, who, through rape and violence, trains her in the discipline of victimized femininity. The passion of New Eve is primarily an education in suffering. Mother's separatist, feminist counterculture, Beulah, is a place where contrarieties exist together. With its reference to William Blake's Beulah, see Day, 1998, this is a matriarchal space where myth is more instructive than history. Beulah, then, is a comic satire of feminist idealizations of the maternal that valorize the mythic and the spatial over the historical and the temporal. Down, down, down into the dark, down into a soft, still, warm, intrauterine, symmetrical place, hung with curtains of crimson plush, into a curtained cabinet where there was a white bed. Underground and cavernous, it is in some respects an exemplary image of the female grotesque, which, as Mary Russo highlights, is inextricably tied to the space of the cave. As bodily metaphor, the grotesque cave tends to look like, and in the most gross metaphorical sense be identified with, the cavernous anatomical female body. Blood, tears, vomit, excrement, all the detritus of the body that is separated out and placed with terror and revulsion, predominantly, though not exclusively, on the side of the feminine, are down there in that cave of abjection. But this underground interior is equally reminiscent of the womb-like haven of the decadent imaginary. Echoing Mother's artificially ornamented anatomy, it is a heavily stylized space adorned in the style of the decadent cabinet which, as discussed in Chapter 2, theatricalizes erotic fantasy. Although in Beulah the gaze is inverted and turned back upon the misogynist and voyeuristic Evelyn, the Passion of New Eve unveils the proximity of feminist and decadent iconographies of the material, suggesting that both are derived from the same mystification, a mystification that exiles women from history. Carter's dystopic depiction of the technologically enhanced world of Beulah critiques the ahistorical underpinnings of its foundational philosophy, that time is man, space is a woman. The text suggests that Mother's attempts to eradicate time from space by way of a complicated mix of mythology and technology cannot be sustained. In this respect, Beulah prefigures what Carter later describes in The Sadian Woman as the timeless, placeless fantasy land of archetypes where all the embodiments of biological supremacy live. Carter deconstructs the cult of the mother goddess to insist upon an engagement with history, the need for a female-speaking subjectivity within a world that is counted out minute by minute. Thus, when Mother finds that she cannot make time stand still, she has a nervous breakdown. History overtook myth, Layla tells Eve, and rendered it obsolete. It is precisely because she places herself outside of time, outside of the historical world, that Mother must eventually abdicate from her mythology. Her retreat back into a cave, the archetypal space of the grotto-esque at the end of the narrative, is not a reinstatement of the maternal principle, but a reflection that her arcane theology has gone underground. Eve realizes in the end that Mother is a figure of speech and has retired to a cave beyond consciousness. The woman whom she meets on the beach, who seems to be Mother, is now a mad old lady whose distinctly aging body appears both physically and metaphorically deflated by its faded glamour. She was wearing a two-piece bathing costume in a red and white spotted fabric and, round her shoulders, a stole of glossy and extravagant blonde fur, but her flesh was wrinkled and ravaged and sagged from her bones. Her mythology demystified, Mother is freed from the constraints of symbolism and reinstated as a flesh and blood subject. Mother is exchanged for Mother. Carter's construction and deconstruction of the maternal in The Passion of New Eve, especially when read in dialogue with The Sadian Woman, demystifies the maternal metaphor and pares down the fraudulent magic from the idea of women to reveal us as we are, simple creatures of flesh and blood. Ward Jove argues that if Simone de Beauvoir and countless others are right, and it is women's biology, her being the sex that gives life, which destines her for second place, then Carter's systematic and endlessly inventive attacks on images of motherhood, her divorcing biology from mothering, are so many blows for women's freedom. Carter is concerned not only with lambasting the figure of the mother in its patriarchal configuration, but with challenging the essential definitions of femininity and motherhood implicit in some aspects of feminist theory. Both The Passion of New Eve and The Sadian Woman reveal the proximity and allure of radical feminist mystifications of the mother goddess and decadent fantasies of the at once enthralling and terrifying castratory femme fatale. At the close of The Passion of New Eve, Eve is pregnant with the child she conceived with Tristessa and is sent off by Mother to give birth to the new kind of being that Carter envisages in Notes from the Front Line. It is, in the end, the maternal archetype, rather than the maternal subject, that is buried underground.